Your history teacher lied to you about medieval times. While you learned about knights and castles, they hid the shocking truth about what really happened behind closed doors. 50 forbidden facts they never wanted you to know. Forget everything you think you know about medieval breakfast. No cornflakes, no orange juice, and definitely no coffee. Dark, coarse bread dominated every morning meal. This wasn't fluffy white bread either. We're talking about dense, gritty loaves that could double as weapons. Most peasants washed down their bread with ale or thin beer. Yeah, beer for breakfast. Makes sense, right? Water was often contaminated, so weak beer was actually safer. Children drank it too, though theirs was watered down even more. If you were lucky, you might get some cheese or onions to jazz up your meal. But fresh fruit, that was rich people food. Apples and pears were luxury items that peasants rarely tasted. Here's the weird part. Nobody ate alone. Families crowded around a single wooden table, sharing bowls and tearing off chunks of bread with their hands. Privacy during meals was practically unheard of. The whole breakfast routine was about survival, not enjoyment. Fill your belly, get some energy, then head out to work the fields. But speaking of survival, you might wonder how these people stayed clean without modern bathrooms and soap. Personal hygiene in medieval times wasn't exactly what we'd call refreshing today. Most people bathed once a month if they were lucky. The rest of the time, well, they just dealt with it. Soap existed, but it was harsh stuff made from animal fat and wood ashes. This wasn't the gentle lavender-scented bars we know. It could scrape your skin raw if you weren't careful. Many people preferred to skip it entirely. Fleas and lice were basically roommates in every household, rich or poor. Nobles might have fancier clothes, but their hair crawled with the same bugs as everyone else's. People accepted this as normal life. Cities did have public bathhouses, though the church wasn't thrilled about them. Too much naked socializing made religious leaders nervous. These bathhouses often got shut down or heavily regulated. For teeth, people rubbed them with salt or chewed on twigs. The salt worked pretty well actually, but imagine doing that every morning. Some folks used rough cloth to scrub their teeth clean, but here's what's really wild about medieval life. The village blacksmith held more power than you'd ever expect. The village blacksmith wasn't just another craftsman. He was basically the medieval version of Tony Stark, minus the fancy tech, plus a lot more sweat and soot. These guys controlled the flow of civilization in ways most people never realized. Every horseshoe that kept travelers moving, that came from his forge. Every plow blade that fed the village, his handiwork, the weapons that protected everyone from bandits and rival lords, all hammered out on his anvil. But here's where it gets interesting. Metalwork was viewed as borderline magical by most peasants. How else could you explain turning cold, hard ore into sharp swords or delicate hinges? The blacksmith knew secrets that seemed supernatural, controlling fire, shaping iron, creating tools that could last generations. This mysterious reputation gave them serious social leverage. Villagers didn't just pay blacksmiths with coins, they owed them favors, brought them the best cuts of meat, and invited them to important decisions. Some blacksmiths became unofficial village leaders, settling disputes and organizing defense plans. Others? Well, they became the kind of people you didn't want to cross. After all, who wants to anger the guy who controls all the sharp objects? Speaking of things people feared in medieval villages, nighttime brought its own set of challenges. When darkness fell in medieval times, privacy was basically a fantasy. Most families crammed into single-room houses where everyone slept together. Parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes even servants shared the same space. Your bedroom was also the kitchen, dining room, and living area. Forget about comfortable mattresses. People slept on straw-stuffed sacks that quickly became home to bed bugs, fleas, and mice. The straw got moldy and smelly, but replacing it cost money most families didn't have. Wealthy folks might afford feather pillows, but even they dealt with creepy crawlers. Rich families hung curtains around their beds for some privacy. These curtains became status symbols. The fancier the fabric, the more important you were. But most people just hoped their family members were heavy sleepers. Children never had their own beds. Brothers and sisters piled together, sometimes 3 or 4 to a mattress. Body heat was actually the main heating system during cold winters. When night came, people lit rushlights, basically sticks dipped in animal fat. Candles existed, but cost too much for regular use. The flickering light barely illuminated anything. making bedtime rituals quick and practical. Speaking of practical matters, medieval people had some creative solutions for midnight bathroom emergencies that might surprise you. Imagine paying your monthly rent with a handful of black peppercorns. Sounds ridiculous. Well, in medieval times, that wasn't just possible, it actually happened. Spices weren't seasoning back then. They were currency. Black pepper was literally worth its weight in silver. A pound could buy you a sheep. Cinnamon cost more than most people earned in months. These tiny seeds and bark pieces traveled thousands of miles from Asia, surviving pirates, storms, and bandits. Every grain that made it to Europe was precious. Wealthy nobles didn't just cook with spices, they flaunted them, hosting dinner without cinnamon or cloves. Social suicide. Rich families would sprinkle expensive spices on everything, even wine, just to show off their wealth. The more exotic, the better. Meanwhile, peasants made do with whatever herbs grew in their gardens. Parsley, thyme, maybe some garlic if they were lucky. The taste gap between rich and poor wasn't just about quantity, it was about having access to flavors from distant continents. Wars were fought over nutmeg islands. Entire trade empires rose and fell chasing these aromatic treasures. But even the wealthy had to be strategic about their next meal. The medieval church didn't just control your soul, it controlled your dinner plate too. Every Christian had to follow strict fasting laws that dictated exactly when you could eat meat, dairy, or eggs. Break these rules, expect a hefty fine or public humiliation. Fish became the star of medieval kitchens during fasting periods. Wednesdays, Fridays, and the entire 40 days of Lent meant no beef, pork, or chicken. Creative cooks found loopholes, though. Beavers were classified as fish because they lived in water. Barnacle geese, also fish, apparently, because people thought they hatched from barnacles attached to driftwood. Then there were the feasts, complete opposites of fasting days. Medieval banquets were theatrical productions featuring roasted peacocks, stuffed swans, and entertainment between courses. Musicians played while jesters performed. Some feasts lasted 8 hours with dozens of courses. The wealthy showed off by serving exotic dishes like whale meat or imported wines. Poor families celebrated with whatever they could afford, maybe a chicken or extra ale, but those fasting restrictions shaped medieval life in ways most people never realize. The constant cycle of denial and celebration created a rhythm that governed entire communities. Speaking of communities, medieval inns became fascinating social hubs where these food rules met the reality of travel. Medieval inns weren't exactly five-star establishments. When travelers stumbled through the door after a long day's journey, they got basic food and a spot in a crowded bed. And yes, you shared that bed with complete strangers. Privacy? What's that? Cities kept tight control over innkeepers, taxing them heavily and regulating their prices. Makes sense when you think about it. Travelers were easy targets for price gouging, but here's where things get weird. Some inns actually allowed animals in the guest rooms. Your horse might sleep closer to you than expected. Even in supposedly trustworthy inns, travelers kept their weapons within arm's reach. The medieval world was dangerous, and a roof over your head didn't guarantee safety. Fellow guests could be thieves, and innkeepers sometimes had questionable morals. Then there's the food situation. Most inns served whatever was cheap and available, usually bread, ale, and maybe some questionable meat stew. The beds were stuffed with straw that hadn't been changed in months. But if you think inn life was rough, wait until you hear about castle living. Those stone fortresses had their own uncomfortable surprises. Hollywood movies love showing castle life as pure luxury. But the reality was pretty miserable for most people living inside those stone walls. Sure, they looked impressive from the outside, but step inside and you'd quickly realize these weren't exactly five-star accommodations. Most castle rooms were freezing cold, smoky, and incredibly drafty. Stone walls might keep enemies out, but they also trap moisture and let icy winds whistle through every crack. Only the main hall got heated by those massive fireplaces you see in movies. Everyone else? Good luck staying warm. Then there's the bathroom situation. Castles had garderobes, basically stone seats with holes that dropped waste straight down the castle walls. No privacy, no comfort, just a cold stone seat hanging over empty air. The smell alone would knock you over. But here's what really gets me. Rodents and bats lived right in the walls. Rats scurried through corridors at night, and bats hung from the rafters. Most servants didn't even get proper sleeping quarters. They just rolled out blankets on the great hall floor. Medieval inns weren't much better, and travelers learned to expect some pretty strange sleeping arrangements. Medieval doctors had some truly bizarre ideas about healing. Barbers didn't just cut hair, they performed surgery, pulled teeth, and bled patients with rusty razors. The red and white barber pole? That's blood and bandages, not a cheerful decoration. Before treating anyone, doctors consulted star charts. They believed your illness depended on when you were born and what planets were doing that week. Mars in the wrong position? Well, that explained your headache. Leeches were the medieval equivalent of aspirin. Got a fever? Slap some blood-sucking worms on your skin. Strangely enough, this sometimes worked because it reduced blood pressure. Even broken clocks are right twice a day. Most medicines came from nearby gardens and forests. Willow bark for pain, which actually contained natural aspirin. Moldy bread on wounds, which we now know had antibiotic properties. These folk remedies weren't completely insane. But here's what's interesting. Those iconic plague masks with long beaks only appeared in the very late medieval period. Most plague doctors just wore regular clothes and hoped for the best. Speaking of protection, medieval armor tells an equally fascinating story about wealth and warfare. A knight's full suit of armor wasn't something you could pick up at the local market. We're talking about weeks of meticulous craftsmanship by skilled armorers who hammered each piece by hand. Every curve had to fit perfectly, or you'd be walking around like a tin can with serious mobility issues. The price, about the same as buying a house. Most knights inherited their armor or went into serious debt to afford it. That gleaming plate mail you see in movies represented a family's entire fortune sitting on someone's back. But here's what's interesting. Despite weighing 45 to 60 pounds, a properly fitted suit distributed weight across the entire body. Knights could actually run, climb, and even do somersaults in full armor. The real problem wasn't the weight, it was the heat. Imagine being trapped in a metal oven during a summer battle. Most soldiers never saw plate armor in their lives. They fought in simple leather jerkins, maybe a basic helmet if they were lucky. Chainmail offered a middle ground for those who could afford it, providing flexibility without breaking the bank. Speaking of breaking things, medieval law had some truly bizarre rules about what counted as criminal behavior. Being declared an outlaw wasn't just losing your good reputation, it meant you literally had zero legal protection. Anyone could kill you without facing punishment. Your property got seized, your family disowned you, and you became less than a ghost in society's eyes. But what crimes actually landed people in this nightmare? Sure, murder and treason were obvious choices, but gossip about the wrong person could destroy your life. Seriously, spreading rumors about nobles or clergy sometimes triggered outlawry declarations. Poaching a single rabbit from the Lord's forest? That's potentially a death sentence wrapped in legal paperwork. Then there were the bizarre trials. Medieval courts sometimes used trial by ordeal, where suspects grabbed red-hot iron bars or plunged their hands into boiling water. If the wounds healed cleanly after 3 days, God had declared them innocent. Burns that festered meant guilt and punishment. Even stranger were animal trials. Yes, actual court proceedings against pigs, dogs, or roosters accused of crimes. Lawyers argued cases, witnesses testified, and sentences were handed down to confused livestock. Most minor offenses resulted in fines rather than imprisonment, since jails were expensive to maintain and people needed to work. Speaking of imprisonment, medieval dungeons held secrets far darker than most people realize. Medieval dungeons weren't the stone fortresses you see in movies. Most prison cells had floors made of packed dirt or mud that turned into a soggy mess when it rained. The smell? Let's just say medieval plumbing wasn't exactly advanced. Guards often saw an opportunity to make extra money. They'd accept bribes from prisoners who wanted better food or maybe a blanket that wasn't crawling with bugs. A few coins could mean the difference between moldy bread and actual soup. Chains and wooden stocks were the go-to punishment tools. Prisoners might spend days with their hands and feet locked in place, unable to move properly. The metal would cut into their skin, leaving permanent marks. But here's what might surprise you. Torture wasn't used on everyone. It was mostly reserved for people accused of serious crimes like treason or murder. Regular thieves or troublemakers usually just got fines or public humiliation instead. The most brutal punishments, though, were saved for the worst offenders. And some of these methods were so horrifying that even hardened medieval folk would look away. The village church wasn't just for Sunday prayers. It ran everything: weddings, funerals, market days, harvest festivals. The church calendar decided when your entire community did anything important. Miss church on Easter? Your neighbors would gossip for months. Those massive church bells weren't just pretty decorations either. When raiders approached or fires broke out, bell ringers would frantically pull those ropes to warn everyone for miles around. The sound could travel farther than any human voice, making it medieval Europe's emergency broadcast system. Here's something most people don't realize. Your local priest was basically the town's paperwork guy. Marriage certificates, birth records, land disputes, business contracts. If it needed writing, Father Thomas was your man. Most villagers couldn't read or write, so priests held incredible power just by controlling information. But whisper during Mass? That'll cost you. Churches fined people for talking, sleeping, or even arriving late. The money went straight into church coffers, and those crypts beneath the altar, they weren't just burial spots. Churches stored gold, silver, and valuable documents underground. Think of it as medieval banking, but with more holy water and considerably fewer security cameras. Speaking of religious life, monks took things even further. Monastery life revolved around prayer, but the silence between those prayers tells the real story. Monks prayed 7 times daily, starting before dawn when most people were still dreaming. The bell would clang at 4 a.m., and sleepy monks shuffled to chapel in the dark. But here's where it gets interesting. Meals were eaten in complete silence, not a single word. Instead, monks developed an entire hand signal system. Point to bread, tap your cup, gesture for more soup. It was like medieval sign language, except breaking it meant punishment. Then there's the bookmaking. Every single book was copied by hand, letter by letter. One Bible could take a monk an entire year to finish. These weren't just words either. They painted elaborate golden letters and tiny detailed pictures in the margins. Talk about job security. The monastery gardens grew more than vegetables. Monks were medieval pharmacists, growing herbs for medicines that actually worked. Willow bark for pain, lavender for sleep, garlic for infections. They knew their stuff. Wealthy monasteries owned vast lands and paid 0 taxes. Not bad for a life of poverty, right? But that tax-free status created some interesting power dynamics with local lords. The Judas cradle wasn't just another medieval torture device. It was psychological warfare disguised as punishment. This pyramid-shaped nightmare stood about 3 feet tall, with its sharp point aimed upward like a deadly spear. Here's how this horror worked. Prisoners were stripped naked and slowly lowered onto the pyramid's tip using ropes and pulleys. The torturer controlled everything: how much weight pressed down, which body parts made contact first. The victim couldn't escape or shift position. What made this particularly brutal? Time. Death wasn't quick. Some prisoners lasted hours, others endured days of agony before succumbing to blood loss, infection, or shock. Guards often added weights to speed things up or removed them to prolong suffering. But the real purpose wasn't just punishment, it was fear. These devices were placed in public squares where everyone could see them. Crowds gathered not out of cruelty, but because authorities wanted witnesses. The message was clear: this could happen to you. The psychological impact spread far beyond the victim. Entire communities learned to stay in line just by walking past these instruments of terror. Speaking of terror, medieval authorities had even more creative ways to make examples of traitors and criminals. Medieval rulers weren't content with simple executions. They needed something that would make people remember for generations. Enter flaying, the practice of skinning someone alive. This wasn't your everyday punishment. Flaying was reserved for the absolute worst crimes: betraying your king, assassinating nobility, or committing treason. The process was exactly what it sounds like: slowly peeling away a person's skin while they were still breathing. Here's the truly horrifying part. Victims rarely died from the skinning itself. Most died from shock or massive blood loss hours into the ordeal. Sometimes it took an entire day. But why such extreme cruelty? Medieval justice operated on fear. Rulers believed that witnessing ultimate punishment would keep everyone else in line. Word of a flaying would spread across kingdoms, carried by terrified witnesses who never forget what they saw. The practice was deliberately public. Town squares, castle courtyards, anywhere crowds could gather. Executioners became skilled at keeping victims conscious as long as possible, maximizing both suffering and the psychological impact on spectators. Yet even in an age of brutal punishments, flaying stood apart as something uniquely terrible. Speaking of medieval justice, the courtroom itself held its own strange terrors. Medieval society had strict dress codes that would make today's school uniforms look relaxed. These sumptuary laws controlled what you could wear based on your social rank, and breaking them wasn't just embarrassing, it was illegal. Peasants were banned from wearing purple, silk, or fur trim. Those colors and fabrics belonged exclusively to nobility and clergy. Even specific shades of red were off limits to commoners. The wealthy wanted everyone to know their place just by looking at them. But here's the weird part. These laws were actually helpful for spotting frauds. If someone dressed above their station, people immediately knew something was fishy. A peasant wearing velvet? Definitely stolen goods, or a con artist trying to sneak into higher society. The penalties weren't jokes either. Fines, public humiliation, or even losing your fancy clothes on the spot. Guards would literally strip illegal garments right off people's backs in the town square. Then there's the practical side. These laws helped maintain the medieval economy's strict class system. Nobody could fake their way up the social ladder with a nice outfit. While clothing laws seem bizarre today, they reveal how deeply medieval medicine relied on unusual and often dangerous treatments. Medieval childhood wasn't exactly filled with Nintendo and soccer practice. Most kids started working by age 7, whether that meant helping in the fields, learning to weave, or carrying water buckets that probably weighed half as much as they did. School? That was a luxury reserved for wealthy boys who might become clerks or priests. The rest learned everything from their parents: how to milk cows, bake bread, or swing a hammer. Girls mastered spinning, cooking, and keeping house before they hit their teens. Toys were whatever kids could find or make. Sticks became swords, stones turned into marbles, and scraps of cloth became dolls. Rich children might own a wooden horse or carved figure, but most entertainment came from games like tag or simple ball kicking. Then there's the harsh reality nobody likes to discuss. Nearly half of all children died before reaching adulthood from disease, accidents, or malnutrition. Families often had many children, partly because they expected to lose several, but childhood wasn't completely grim. Even peasant kids found time to play and laugh between chores. Speaking of harsh realities, though, medieval women faced their own surprising challenges and opportunities. Medieval women weren't just sitting around waiting for their husbands to return from war. Many ran entire businesses while the men were away. Breweries, bakeries, and inns often had women as their main operators. These weren't small side hustles either. Some women controlled significant trade operations. Take widows, for example. Once their husbands died, they suddenly gained legal rights that married women couldn't touch. They could own property, sign contracts, and make business decisions. It's almost like marriage was the thing holding them back legally. Then there's the surprising world of female craftspeople. Sure, most blacksmiths were men, but records show women working metal in several towns. Female carpenters, shoemakers, and even some armorers existed. The guild system sometimes tried to keep them out, but money talks louder than rules. Noble women wielded serious power too. When kings died, their wives often became regents, essentially running entire kingdoms. Some managed vast estates with hundreds of workers. And let's not forget nuns. They weren't just praying all day. Many taught reading, ran hospitals, and created medicines that actually worked. Speaking of medicine, medieval doctors had some truly bizarre treatment methods. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it completely rewrote European society. Between 1347 and 1351, this plague wiped out somewhere between 30 to 60% of Europe's population. Entire villages simply vanished from the map, never to be rebuilt. Those eerie plague doctor masks filled with herbs, they actually believed bad smells caused disease. The beak-like masks were stuffed with aromatic substances like cloves and dried roses. Turns out they were completely wrong about how plague spread, but the costumes definitely looked terrifying. Survivor towns turned into fortresses overnight. They banned all outsiders and blocked roads for months. Some places posted guards with crossbows to shoot anyone trying to enter. Paranoia ran so deep that families abandoned their own relatives at city gates. But here's the weird part. Surviving peasants suddenly found themselves in high demand. With so many dead, labor became incredibly valuable. Serfs could demand higher wages and better treatment. Land that once supported entire families sat empty, waiting for new owners. The plague basically fast-forwarded social change by centuries. While doctors were still figuring out what worked, regular people were discovering that surviving a nightmare sometimes comes with unexpected benefits. Medieval people drank beer like we drink water today. Seriously. Your average peasant gulped down gallons of the stuff daily, and it wasn't because they loved getting tipsy at breakfast. Water was basically a death sentence back then. Rivers doubled as sewage systems, wells got contaminated by everything nasty, and boiling water for safety wasn't common knowledge yet. Beer, though, the brewing process killed off most harmful bacteria. Parents literally gave watered-down ale to their kids because it was safer than straight H2O. But here's the thing. Medieval beer was nothing like today's strong brews. Most contained barely 1 to 3% alcohol, weaker than modern light beer. You'd need to chug enormous amounts just to catch a buzz. Women dominated the brewing scene, mixing up batches in their kitchens using whatever grains they could find. Laws actually regulated beer strength to prevent public drunkenness. Makes sense, right? Can't have your entire workforce stumbling around hammered all day. The biggest problem wasn't hangovers, though. It was spoilage. Without refrigeration, beer went bad within days, sometimes hours. Speaking of food going bad, medieval nobles had their own wild solutions for preserving fancy meals. Medieval nobles didn't just collect gold and land, they hoarded exotic animals like trophies, turning their estates into medieval zoos that would make today's pet owners jealous. Falcons were the ultimate status symbol. Kings literally passed laws about who could own which birds. A peregrine falcon? That belonged to earls only. Peasants caught with the wrong bird faced serious punishment. These weren't just pets either. They were hunting machines worth more than most people's houses. But falcons were just the beginning. Wealthy lords imported monkeys from distant lands, kept peacocks strutting around their gardens, and bred tiny lapdogs that cost fortunes to maintain. Some nobles even owned bears, kept chained in courtyards for entertainment. The really wealthy? Their pets had servants, actual human beings whose job was feeding and grooming animals all day. Imagine explaining that career choice to your parents. Then there's the breeding obsession. Lords competed over who had the most exotic bloodlines, not just for themselves, but for their animals too. A well-bred hunting hawk could launch political alliances between families. Speaking of things that require daily maintenance, medieval teeth tell their own fascinating story about status and survival. Medieval people actually had better teeth than you might expect. Without sugar flooding their diets, tooth decay happened far less often than today. Their biggest dental enemy? Gritty bread that wore down enamel like sandpaper. When teeth did need cleaning, people got creative. Twigs worked as toothbrushes. Birch and oak were popular choices. Others used rough cloth dipped in salt or herbal mixtures. Sage, mint, and rosemary made breath fresher while scrubbing away food bits. But here's where things got brutal. Got a toothache? The local barber surgeon would yank it out with iron pliers. No numbing, no gentle technique. Just grip, twist, and pull while you screamed into a leather strap. Rotten teeth meant serious trouble. Infections could kill, and they often did. Some desperate souls tried burning out the nerve with hot irons. Others chewed cloves or drank themselves senseless with ale before extractions. The wealthy sometimes replaced missing teeth with carved wood or animal teeth tied in place. Uncomfortable and gross, but better than gaping holes. While teeth lasted longer back then, losing one still hurt like hell. Speaking of pain, medieval fairs offered their own mix of pleasure and peril. Medieval fairs weren't just weekend markets, they were massive economic events that transformed entire regions for weeks at a time. Picture thousands of merchants traveling hundreds of miles with wagons full of silk from China, pepper from India, and glass so fine it looked like captured sunlight. These weren't your typical town gatherings either. The biggest fairs, like those in Champagne, France, operated under special laws that protected foreign traders. Murder a visiting merchant? That was treated worse than killing a local. Cheat someone with false weights? You'd face penalties that could bankrupt your family for generations. But here's what made these fairs truly wild. They were part business convention, part carnival. Acrobats performed between fabric stalls. Musicians played while spice dealers haggled over cinnamon prices. Jesters mocked the crowd while goldsmiths displayed rings worth more than most people's houses. The really clever part? Fair organizers created temporary currencies and credit systems that let merchants trade without hauling chests of actual coins everywhere. Pretty advanced for people we think barely understood economics, right? Of course, all this international commerce needed protection, and medieval warfare had some seriously creative tricks for keeping enemies away. Medieval soldiers didn't just swing swords and hope for the best. They had tricks that would make modern special forces jealous. Boiling oil gets all the attention, but defenders actually preferred sand. Why? Hot sand stuck to armor and worked its way into every gap, burning skin for hours. Lime powder blinded attackers instantly when thrown from castle walls. Some fortresses kept barrels of tar ready to pour on siege ladders. Imagine trying to climb while covered in sticky, burning goo. Archers weren't just pointing and shooting either. They waxed their arrow feathers with beeswax for perfect flight patterns. Smart knights positioned polished metal mirrors on castle walls, using them like periscopes to spot enemy movements without exposing themselves. Then there were murder holes, innocent-sounding name for something terrifying. These openings in castle ceilings let defenders drop rocks, arrows, or boiling liquids directly onto invaders below. Attackers never knew when death might rain down from above. Siege towers looked impressive, rolling toward walls, but defenders had counters. They'd shoot flaming arrows or use long poles to push the towers away from walls. Speaking of clever defenses, some castles had hidden sally ports, secret doors for surprise attacks on unsuspecting besiegers. Getting caught for petty crimes in medieval times meant facing the pillory, and trust me, this wasn't just standing around looking embarrassed. The pillory was basically medieval Twitter, but instead of angry comments, you got rotten vegetables hurled at your face. Picture this contraption. Wooden boards with holes for your head and hands locking you in place for hours. You couldn't sit, couldn't duck, couldn't even wipe your nose. The whole town turned into your personal nightmare audience. Theft, spreading gossip, cheating customers, or selling watery ale. Straight to the pillory you went. And people didn't just walk by politely, they brought their worst produce specifically to throw at you. Moldy bread, spoiled eggs, even human waste sometimes joined the party. The pain wasn't just from flying garbage either. Standing bent over for hours made your back scream and your legs go numb. Some folks passed out from the strain, but the wooden restraints kept them upright anyway. Here's the weird part. Sometimes crowds got so worked up that they turned violent, beating prisoners to death. What started as public shaming could escalate into full riots, making even simple punishments deadly affairs. But medieval justice had even more creative ways to make people suffer. Medieval dental work makes modern root canals look like spa treatments. When your tooth went bad, the local barber surgeon grabbed iron pliers and yanked it out while you screamed. No Novocaine, no gentle extraction, just raw strength and prayer. The real horror wasn't just the pain. Rotten teeth killed people regularly through deadly infections that spread to the jaw and brain. One bad molar could literally end your life in weeks. Replacement teeth? Well, wealthy folks sometimes got wooden pegs or carved animal teeth hammered into their gums. Most people just lived with gaps and chewed on one side of their mouth forever. Mouthwash existed, sort of. People gargled with vinegar or wine mixed with herbs, which probably burned like fire on open wounds. The lucky ones had access to cloves, which actually numbed pain temporarily. When agony became unbearable, medieval dentists had two solutions: opium if you were rich, or getting drunk if you weren't. Some patients passed out from alcohol before the pliers even touched their teeth. Speaking of daily pain, nothing compared to what happened when entire towns ran out of their most basic necessity. When harvests failed, medieval towns turned into powder kegs. Bad weather meant grain rotted in fields or never grew at all. Bread prices didn't just rise, they exploded overnight. A loaf that cost a penny suddenly demanded 3 or 4. Hungry people don't stay calm for long. Crowds gathered outside bakeries, shouting and demanding answers. Bakers became public enemies, accused of hoarding grain or charging unfair prices. Some got dragged from their shops and beaten by angry mobs who thought they were getting rich off starvation. But here's the thing. Most bakers weren't villains. They bought grain from merchants who jacked up prices first. Local laws forced bakers to sell bread at fixed rates, even when their costs skyrocketed. Many went broke trying to feed their towns. Authorities tried controlling the chaos with soldiers and price controls. Sometimes they worked. Other times, bread riots spread like wildfire through entire regions. People smashed windows, looted grain stores, and fought in the streets over crusts. These food riots revealed how fragile medieval life really was. But the daily dangers of cooking that bread, that's where things got even more interesting. Medieval kitchens were basically controlled chaos with a side of third-degree burns. Most homes cooked over open wood fires that filled rooms with thick, choking smoke. No fancy exhaust fans here, just windows you hoped would catch a breeze. Here's the kicker. Most people didn't even have their own ovens. Towns shared one massive public oven, usually owned by the lord or church. You prepare your bread or pie at home, then carry it through muddy streets to wait in line. The baker would slide your food into the communal oven using a long wooden paddle, and you'd better hope nobody mixed up whose dinner was whose. Professional cooks developed an almost supernatural ability to judge oven temperature. They'd stick their hand inside and count how long they could keep it there before the pain became unbearable. 2 seconds, perfect for bread. 1 second, too hot, wait it out. Wealthy households sometimes had small indoor stoves, mainly used for brewing medicinal potions or heating wine. But even noble cooks sported permanent burn marks on their arms, battle scars from wrestling with medieval fire. Speaking of medical treatments, those burn remedies used some truly bizarre ingredients that might surprise you. Medieval doctors had some truly bizarre ingredients in their medicine cabinets. We're talking about remedies that included honey mixed with pig's fat, crushed pearls, and even ground emeralds for the wealthy patients. The logic? Expensive meant effective, right? But here's where it gets really gross. Animal dung was a popular wound treatment. Doctors genuinely believed that fresh manure could help heal cuts and infections. Sometimes they weren't entirely wrong. Certain animal droppings did contain helpful bacteria, though they had no clue why it worked. Then there's the accidentally brilliant stuff. Moldy bread was often applied to infected wounds, and it actually helped prevent further infection. Medieval healers had stumbled onto what we now know as penicillin centuries before Fleming made it famous. Doctors wrote their bizarre recipes on expensive parchment scrolls, treating these concoctions like precious secrets. A typical remedy might call for crushed beetle shells, wine, and a pinch of gold dust. The wealthier you were, the more exotic your medicine became. Yet for all their strange ingredients, herbal remedies remained the most trusted treatments. Speaking of trust, medieval legal systems had their own peculiar ways of determining truth. Medieval nobles had way too much time on their hands. What did they do with it? They created fake courts to judge love affairs. These weren't real legal proceedings. Rich ladies would sit as judges while men presented cases about romance, heartbreak, and whether someone's girlfriend was being unreasonable. Seriously. Knights would argue about proper courting techniques like lawyers debating property disputes. The most famous was Eleanor of Aquitaine's court in France. She listened to dramatic complaints about unrequited love and issue rulings. Sir Geoffrey must write 3 poems to prove his devotion. Lady Margaret owes her suitor 1 dance at the next feast. Winners got prizes, poems, or just bragging rights. But here's the weird part. These mock courts actually influenced real marriage disputes. Nobles started using courtly love rules in actual legal cases. The whole thing shaped medieval literature too. Those romantic night stories, they came from these silly court games. Then there were the traveling minstrels who spread these love court stories across Europe, turning local gossip into epic tales. Speaking of entertainment that captivated medieval audiences, nothing matched the spectacle of magnificent war horses thundering across battlefields. Medieval war horses were basically 4-legged sports cars that cost more than most people's homes. A fully trained destrier could buy you an entire village, and that's not an exaggeration. These weren't your average farm animals either. They were bred for battle, trained to kick and bite enemies, and strong enough to carry a knight in full armor without breaking a sweat. But here's the thing most people get wrong about medieval times. Not everyone rode horses. Actually, most people walked everywhere. Horses were for the wealthy, and even then you needed special permission to own certain breeds. Royal bloodlines weren't just for people. Then there's the practical side nobody talks about. Horses needed custom shoes for different weather. Snowshoes, mud shoes, even spiked versions for ice. Blacksmiths made fortunes just keeping horses walking properly. Horse racing became huge at festivals too. Peasants would bet their week's wages on which noble's horse would win. The excitement was infectious, and winners became local celebrities overnight. Speaking of entertainment, medieval courts had another fascinating group of performers who could mock kings without losing their heads. Court jesters weren't just entertainers dancing around for laughs. They held one of the strangest privileges in medieval society: the right to mock anyone, including kings, without losing their heads. These professional fools could insult nobles, criticize royal decisions, and even make jokes about the king's appearance or policies. Why? Because their words were considered harmless folly. Smart rulers actually valued this feedback wrapped in humor. It was the only honest criticism they'd ever hear. Many jesters were dwarves or people with disabilities, seen as touched by God and therefore speaking divine truth through comedy. But don't think they were helpless. Some were incredibly clever spies for their royal patrons, gathering secrets while everyone dismissed them as harmless entertainers. Then there's the fascinating tradition of Fool's Day, where servants could boss their masters around for 24 hours. Tables turned completely. Lords served meals while their servants gave orders and cracked jokes at their expense. Some jesters even wrote early theatrical works and developed comedy routines that influenced entertainment for centuries. These weren't simple clowns. They were sharp-witted performers navigating dangerous political waters. Speaking of strange medieval beliefs, people carried some truly bizarre superstitions and charms for protection. Medieval people believed in some truly bizarre superstitions that would make modern conspiracy theorists look reasonable. Hanging garlic and iron above doorways wasn't just about cooking or decoration. It was serious magical protection against demons and evil spirits lurking outside. Graveyard dirt was like medieval insurance. People actually carried pouches of cemetery soil, believing it would shield them from curses and bad luck. Makes you wonder how many pockets smelled like death, right? Black cats got the worst deal of all. These poor animals were literally hunted down because folks thought they were demons in disguise or witches' servants. Crossing paths with one meant instant bad fortune was heading your way. Then there's the crossroads, fear. These intersections weren't just confusing for travelers, they were considered supernatural danger zones after dark. Evil spirits supposedly gathered there to make deals and trap souls. Lucky charms were everywhere. Animal bones carved into shapes, wooden amulets, even rabbit feet dangled from belts and necks. Everyone carried something magical for protection. But while people clutched their bone charms and avoided black cats, they still needed to travel those dangerous medieval roads and bridges, which presented very real, non-magical threats. Building a bridge in medieval times wasn't just engineering, it was an act of faith. Most bridges were made of wood and collapsed regularly, taking travelers down with them. Stone bridges, those were massive projects that could take decades to complete. The famous London Bridge took over 30 years to build and was considered one of the world's wonders. But here's the twist. Most people never crossed fancy stone bridges. They used rickety wooden planks, ferries, or just waded through rivers hoping not to drown. Roads were even worse nightmares. What we called roads were basically muddy tracks carved by countless feet and wagon wheels. After rain, they turned into swamps. Bandits loved these conditions because travelers moved slowly and couldn't escape quickly. Then there's the brilliant medieval solution to funding bridges: toll gates. Want to cross? Pay up. Some bridges had houses and shops built right on them, turning crossings into mini-towns. Bridge keepers became wealthy from collecting fees, while travelers cursed every coin they had to drop. But successful bridge builders, they were treated like saints. Some literally became saints after death. Speaking of medieval saints and their strange powers, creating a medieval book wasn't like hitting print on your computer. Every single page started with an animal skin, usually a calf or sheep. The poor creature's hide got scraped, stretched, and treated until it became smooth parchment. One book could require dozens of animals. Then came the real work. Monks hunched over desks for months, sometimes years, copying each letter by hand. Their fingers cramped, their backs ached, and one tiny mistake meant starting the entire page over. No whiteout existed back then. The fancy books got illuminated letters, those gorgeous gold leaf capitals that practically glowed on the page. Artists mixed real gold with egg whites and painted each decoration with brushes made from squirrel hair. Talk about expensive artwork. Here's the crazy part. Finished books were so valuable they got chained to library tables like prisoners. Literally chained. Steal a book and you'd face serious punishment because that single volume represented months of labor and a small fortune in materials. Most people never owned a book in their entire lives. Reading was mainly for priests and nobles who had the time and money for such luxuries. But speaking of luxuries, wait until you hear about medieval festivals where everything got turned completely upside down. The Festival of Fools turned medieval society completely upside down for one wild day each year. Peasants dressed as bishops and delivered mock sermons while actual clergy sat in the pews like regular folk. Makes sense, right? Well, not really, but that was the whole point. Picture the town, drunk, stumbling around in stolen robes, blessing people with ale instead of holy water. Meanwhile, servants paraded through streets wearing their master's finest clothes, shouting orders at anyone who'd listen. The entire social hierarchy became a complete joke. But here's the weird part. Church leaders actually supported this madness. They believed letting people blow off steam prevented real rebellions. Smart thinking, considering how much anger peasants bottled up the other 364 days. Then there were the parades. Animal masks, drunken singing, and dancing that would make your grandmother faint. People acted like absolute lunatics, knowing tomorrow they'd return to bowing and scraping before their betters. Sometimes the celebrations got too rowdy and ended in actual violence. Speaking of entertainment, medieval folks had other ways to pass time when they weren't pretending to be bishops. Music in medieval times wasn't just entertainment, it was survival. Minstrels wandered from village to village, carrying news, gossip, and stories wrapped in melodies. No newspapers meant these traveling musicians were your CNN, Fox News, and Entertainment Tonight all rolled into one. The instruments were simpler but surprisingly effective. Harps, fiddles, and drums dominated most gatherings. Peasants couldn't afford fancy lutes, so they made do with wooden flutes or simple drums fashioned from animal skins. The wealthy? They had entire orchestras for dinner parties. Dancing happened everywhere. Village squares turned into dance floors during festivals, with people spinning barefoot on dirt and stones. No fancy ballrooms needed. The moves were energetic and communal. Everyone joined in, from toddlers to grandparents. But here's the clever part. Drum beats weren't just for fun. Farmers used rhythmic music to coordinate harvest work. Teams would thresh grain or pick crops to specific beats, making backbreaking labor more bearable and efficient. Even the church got musical. Gregorian chants filled cathedrals, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that left peasants awestruck. Speaking of awe-inspiring medieval experiences, wait until you hear about the surprising world of public bathhouses. Public bathhouses were surprisingly common in medieval cities. Men and women had separate hours, though some places got creative with dividers down the middle. These weren't just about getting clean either. Bathhouses became social hubs where people gossiped, made business deals, and showed off their latest tunics. But here's where it gets interesting. Traveling merchants brought bathing customs from all over Europe and beyond. Italian traders introduced perfumed oils. German visitors preferred scalding hot water that would make you jump. Eastern European customs included birch branch scrubbing that left people looking like they'd wrestled with a tree. Then the plague hit, and everything changed. People started blaming bad air and open pores for spreading disease. Suddenly, those relaxing communal baths seemed dangerous. Many bathhouses closed permanently, while others, well, let's just say they found new business models. Some turned into gambling dens or brothels, which didn't help their reputation with the church. Others became private clubs for wealthy merchants only. The weird part? This fear of bathing stuck around for centuries after the plague ended. Speaking of strange medieval fears, knights had their own bizarre set of rules they lived by. When most people think of knights, they picture shining armor and perfect honor. Reality was messier. Knights swore elaborate oaths to protect the weak and serve God, but many treated peasants like dirt. These vows sounded impressive in castle halls, yet plenty of knights spent their time pillaging villages or picking fights with neighbors. Tournaments became the safer alternative to actual war. Knights could test their combat skills without dying, though broken bones were common. The crowds loved it. Think medieval WWE with real weapons and way more blood. Then there's the armor situation. Each knight decorated their gear with personal symbols, animals, or family colors. A lion might represent courage, while a boar showed stubbornness. Some chose dolphins or roses, which seems less intimidating but made sense to them. Breaking a knightly oath meant social death. Exile, disgrace, loss of lands, everything gone. The shame followed families for generations. Many knights traveled for crusades and holy wars, convinced they were doing God's work. Others stayed home, managing estates and settling local disputes. But beneath all that ceremony and pageantry, knights remained professional warriors in a violent world where survival often trumped honor. Those bizarre plague doctor outfits weren't just Halloween costumes gone wrong. They were medieval hazmat suits designed by pure fear and questionable science. The famous beak wasn't for show. Doctors stuffed it with aromatic herbs, dried flowers, and spices, believing pleasant smells would block the bad air that supposedly caused plague. Rosemary, thyme, and lavender became their medical arsenal against death itself. The longer the beak, the more protection they thought they had. Their entire body disappeared under heavy leather or waxed fabric, every inch covered. Thick gloves, long coats, and wide-brimmed hats completed the terrifying ensemble. Those creepy glass goggles, they protected eyes from evil vapors floating around infected patients. But here's the twisted part. The costume actually worked, just not how they thought. All that coverage accidentally created a barrier against fleas carrying the real plague bacteria. Medieval doctors stumbled into proper protective equipment while chasing completely wrong theories about disease. The outfit backfired socially, though. Children screamed when they saw these walking nightmares approaching. Parents hid. Even desperate patients sometimes refused treatment from these bird-like figures of death. Speaking of medieval misconceptions, doctors weren't the only ones using codes and secrets to protect themselves. Medieval spies had to get creative when it came to hiding their messages. While we think of invisible ink as some modern spy movie trick, they were already using lemon juice centuries ago. Heat up the paper and boom, secret text appears like magic. But that wasn't their only trick. Latin became the perfect code language since most people couldn't read it anyway. Even if someone intercepted your message, they'd need education to crack it. Smart move, right? Then there's the really clever stuff. Spies would hide coded messages inside innocent-looking poems or religious texts. A love letter might actually contain military secrets. Each third word could spell out troop movements. The poem about spring flowers actually detailed escape routes. Wax seals weren't just for show either. Hollow them out, stuff a tiny message inside, seal it back up. Guards would check the obvious places, but never think to break open that fancy wax stamp. Some operatives used body signals, too. A certain way of adjusting your cloak meant danger ahead. Scratching your ear could signal mission complete. Speaking of secret communications, medieval merchants had their own network of hidden messages that helped build massive trading empires across continents. Medieval merchants didn't just sell things locally. They built massive trading networks that stretched across continents, connecting Europe to Asia and Africa in ways that would make modern logistics companies jealous. Venice and Genoa became Europe's biggest trading powerhouses. Their ships carried everything from English wool to Chinese silk, making these Italian city-states incredibly wealthy. Venetian merchants were so rich they practically owned entire trade routes. But here's what's wild. A single trading voyage could take months or even years. Ships loaded with European goods would sail to Constantinople, trade for Asian spices and silk, then return home. If they made it back alive, the profits were enormous. Black pepper bought in India could sell for 20 times its price in London. These trading fairs weren't just about business either. They introduced Europeans to new foods, fabrics, and ideas. Imagine tasting sugar for the first time or seeing porcelain so delicate it seemed magical. The risks were insane, though. Pirates, storms, and wars could destroy entire fortunes overnight, yet merchants kept sailing because the rewards were worth dying for. Speaking of death, medieval public executions were their own kind of spectacle. Public executions weren't just about punishment, they were the ultimate medieval entertainment. Crowds traveled for miles to watch someone meet their end, treating it like a festival complete with food vendors and street performers. The whole thing followed a twisted script. Condemned prisoners got paraded through town on a cart, sometimes forced to wear signs listing their crimes. Executioners became local celebrities, often wearing masks or hoods to add drama. Some even had signature techniques that drew bigger audiences. But here's the weird part. Musicians actually played at scaffolds. Drums rolled before the final moment, and sometimes entire bands performed between multiple executions. It was like a concert, except someone died at the end. Executions served as brutal teaching moments too. Local leaders used them to remind everyone what happened when you broke the law. Stealing bread? Here's what awaits. Adultery? Watch this. The fear factor was the whole point. Executioners got paid surprisingly well for their grim work, but they lived as social outcasts. Nobody wanted to grab drinks with the guy who chopped off heads for a living. Speaking of social outcasts, there was another group that faced even stranger treatment. Witch trials weren't just medieval hysteria. They were deadly serious business with bizarre scientific methods. The water test was particularly twisted. Accused witches got tied up and thrown into ponds. If they floated, they were guilty witches who rejected holy water. If they sank and drowned, well, at least they died innocent. Then there were needle tests. Investigators poked suspected witches all over, searching for spots that didn't bleed or feel pain. These devil's marks supposedly proved supernatural connections. Professional witch finders made good money traveling town to town with their special needles. Most accused witches weren't cackling hags brewing potions. They were often widows, healers, or women who'd angered neighbors. Got into a property dispute? Your accuser might claim you cursed their cow. New herbal remedies? Clearly, you were practicing dark magic. The church sometimes stepped in to protect accused women from angry mobs. Ironically, religious authorities often showed more mercy than regular townspeople. Trials peaked in the late medieval period, spreading fear across Europe. But speaking of fashion trends that spread across medieval Europe, some clothing choices were just as extreme as witch hunting and far more ridiculous. Medieval fashionistas took things to extremes that would make today's runway models look conservative. Pointed shoes called poulaines grew so absurdly long that some reached over a foot in length. Walking became a genuine challenge. Imagine trying to climb stairs when your toes extend into next week. Laws eventually had to limit shoe length because people kept tripping over their own feet. Hats told everyone exactly where you stood in society. Poor folks wore simple hoods that could double as blankets. The wealthy, they strutted around with feathered contraptions so tall they barely fit through doorways. Some hats required their own servants just to keep them balanced. Then there's the button revolution. These little fasteners first appeared on rich people's clothes as pure decoration. They didn't even work. Actual functional buttons took decades to catch on. Meanwhile, lace became the ultimate status symbol, with nobles spending fortunes on intricate patterns that took months to create. Winter furs were worn year-round, regardless of weather. Nothing said, "I'm important," like sweating through a fox coat in July. Fashion trends spread slowly from France and Italy, taking years to reach remote villages. But fashion wasn't just about looking good. Some medieval clothing choices bordered on dangerous territory. Getting fresh, clean water in medieval times? That was basically winning the lottery. Most people had about as much chance of finding pure water as they did of spotting a unicorn. Wells were the main water source, but here's the thing. They were hand-dug by people who had zero understanding of geology. These wells collapsed constantly, sometimes taking entire families down with them. And even when they worked, the water tasted like dirt, mixed with whatever dead animal happened to fall in last week. Rivers seemed like a better option until you realized they flowed right past everyone's waste pits. People literally dumped their chamber pots upstream from where others collected drinking water. Brilliant planning, right? The smart ones boiled their water with herbs like mint or sage. This actually helped kill some of the nasty stuff floating around, though they had no idea why. Towns with money built stone walls around their wells to keep animals and debris out. But bad water still caused massive disease outbreaks that wiped out entire neighborhoods. Clean water was so precious that some people spent their whole day just finding it. Speaking of precious things medieval people obsessed over, wait until you hear what they did for entertainment. Medieval people weren't just sitting around waiting for entertainment to be invented. They had games that would make modern sports fans jealous. Chess wasn't some fancy noble hobby. Everyone played it. Peasants carved crude pieces from wood scraps, while lords commissioned elaborate ivory sets. But here's the kicker. Medieval chess had different rules. The queen could barely move, making games drag on for hours. Dice games were absolutely everywhere. Taverns, markets, even church steps after service. People bet everything. Coins, food, clothes off their backs. Some dice were loaded with mercury or weighted with lead. Cheating was an art form. Then there were the brutal sports. Jousting tournaments drew crowds like medieval Super Bowls. Knights charged at each other with 12-foot lances, aiming to knock opponents off horses traveling at full speed. Death was common, but crowds loved it. Football existed, but it was more like organized warfare. Entire villages played against each other across fields, through streams, even into neighboring towns. Rules? What rules? Broken bones were expected. Wrestling matches happened at every fair. Winners got actual prizes, a pig, a barrel of ale, or a year's worth of bread. But burial customs reveal just how dangerous medieval life really was. Death in medieval times wasn't the sanitized affair we know today. When someone died, the whole village knew about it immediately. Bodies were washed and wrapped at home by family members, not professional undertakers. Burial happened fast, really fast. Without embalming, you had maybe a day or two before things got unpleasant. Most graves were dug only 3 or 4 feet deep, because digging was backbreaking work with primitive tools. This shallow depth meant older bones often got mixed up with new burials. Grave diggers would just toss the old skulls and femurs to the side. Then there's the coin tradition. Families placed copper or silver coins on the deceased's eyes, supposedly to pay the ferryman in the afterlife. Poor families used pottery shards instead. Funeral processions were loud, dramatic affairs. Professional mourners wailed and tore their clothes for effect. Musicians played somber tunes while everyone wore black robes or dark cloth tied around their arms. Rich merchants and nobles built elaborate family tombs, but most people ended up in unmarked graves in the churchyard. Space was so limited that bodies were often stacked on top of each other. But medieval people had some fascinating beliefs about what happened after death. Medieval people were absolutely convinced that dragons soared through distant skies and unicorns pranced in hidden forests. Well, why wouldn't they be? Their maps literally had "Here be monsters" scrawled across unexplored territories, complete with drawings of sea serpents and winged beasts. But here's the weird part. These weren't just silly bedtime stories. Educated nobles and scholars genuinely believed these creatures existed somewhere beyond their known world. They'd trade unicorn horns for massive fortunes, not knowing they were buying narwhal tusks from clever merchants. Then there were the local legends that kept entire villages awake at night. Every creaking forest had its resident troll. Every unexplained illness, obviously caused by a witch's curse or an angry forest spirit. People would swear they'd seen giants walking through morning mist or heard the wails of banshees before someone died. Supernatural omens explained everything medieval folks couldn't understand. Strange lights in the sky meant war was coming. A 2-headed calf, bad harvest ahead. These stories weren't entertainment, they were medieval science, helping people make sense of a world full of mysteries they couldn't possibly explain any other way. The line between reality and legend was beautifully, terrifyingly blurred.